Her husband kicked her out when he saw the triplet didn't look like him. 10 years later, he learned a truth that shocked him. Subscribe, and where are you watching from? Write in the comments. Sophia had always been a woman of ambition. Raised in a working-class neighborhood by a single mother who instilled in her the values of perseverance and independence, she had learned from an early age that nothing in life came easy. Hard work, determination, and resilience had shaped her into the woman she was today, a successful entrepreneur, a self-made businesswoman who had built her small but thriving company from the ground up. Her journey had never been simple, but Sophia had never been one to complain. She prided herself on her ability to stand on her own 2 feet, to carve out a place in the world through sheer force of will. She had built a comfortable life for herself, one where she answered to no one but her own dreams and ambitions. Yet, for all her success, there was one thing she had never quite managed to conquer: love. It wasn't that she hadn't tried. Over the years she had dated, had even come close to settling down once or twice, but nothing had ever felt quite right. Either the men she met were intimidated by her success, or they were too eager to ride on the coattails of it. Some wanted a trophy, others a caretaker, but none seemed to truly appreciate her for who she was. And then she met Lucas. Lucas was different from any man she had ever encountered. He was charming, confident, and completely at ease with himself. Tall, with sharp blue eyes and a smile that seemed to disarm even the most skeptical of hearts, he had an effortless charisma that made people gravitate toward him. Sophia had met him at a charity gala, an event she had almost skipped but had attended at the last minute to support a friend. From the moment Lucas approached her, she had felt an inexplicable pull toward him. He was funny, intelligent, and most importantly, he didn't seem the least bit threatened by her success. If anything, he admired it. He listened to her speak about her business with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, and shared his own experiences in the corporate world. By the end of the night, she was intrigued. Their first date was the kind of evening that left her breathless. Lucas planned everything down to the smallest detail: an intimate rooftop dinner under the stars, a playlist of her favorite jazz classics playing softly in the background. He was attentive, engaging, and unlike anyone she had ever met. Sophia, who had always been cautious with her heart, found herself letting down her guard for the first time in years. The relationship progressed quickly. Lucas was intoxicating in his presence, making her feel adored, valued, and understood in ways she hadn't thought possible. He wasn't just a lover, he was a partner, someone who encouraged her, who celebrated her successes as if they were his own. Sophia had never believed in fairy tales, but with Lucas it was hard not to feel as though she had stumbled into one. Yet there were warning signs, little moments of possessiveness that she brushed aside. The way his expression darkened whenever other men looked at her, the occasional sharpness in his tone when she was too busy with work to spend time with him, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his demeanor when she spoke too confidently in social settings. But love, as it so often does, made her blind to the red flags. When she found out she was pregnant, she was terrified at first. She had never imagined herself as a mother, not because she didn't want children, but because she had always been too focused on building her life to consider it. But Lucas's reaction was everything she had hoped for. He was overjoyed, lifting her into his arms, spinning her around their kitchen, whispering promises of a beautiful future together. "We're going to be a family," he had said, pressing his forehead against hers. "I'll take care of you, of our baby. You'll never have to worry about a thing." It was the first time in her life Sophia had ever allowed herself to believe in something so completely. She had spent years standing alone, relying only on herself, and now, for the first time, she had someone to lean on. But as the pregnancy progressed, she began to notice a shift in Lucas. At first, it was subtle, a certain tension in his shoulders when they talked about the future, a restlessness in his movements that hadn't been there before. She chalked it up to nerves. After all, becoming a father was a life-altering event. But there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Lucas's parents had never fully approved of their relationship, and while they had been polite in public, Sophia had always sensed their quiet disapproval. They came from old money, the kind of family that valued lineage and tradition, and she had no doubt that they had envisioned a very different kind of daughter-in-law. Though Lucas had always reassured her that their opinions didn't matter, she wondered if, deep down, he had begun to feel the weight of their expectations. As her belly grew, so did the distance between them. Lucas still attended doctor's appointments, still kissed her forehead and told her he loved her, but there was a coldness in his touch now, a distance in his eyes that made her uneasy. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, but in the quiet moments, when she lay awake at night feeling the gentle kicks of their unborn children, doubt gnawed at her. Then came the biggest surprise of all. She was having triplets. 3 tiny lives growing inside her, 3 souls she was about to bring into the world. Lucas's reaction was unreadable. He smiled, congratulated her, but there was something in his expression that didn't quite match the moment. She told herself it was just shock. After all, how could anyone be fully prepared for the news that they were about to become parents to 3 children at once? Despite everything, she clung to hope. She believed that once the babies arrived, everything would fall into place. Lucas loved her, and she loved him. They would figure it out together. She had no way of knowing that in a matter of weeks, the man she loved would turn into a stranger. That the moment their children entered the world, the foundation of her life would be shattered beyond recognition. She had no idea that the biggest betrayal of her life was yet to come. The day Sophia went into labor was nothing like she had imagined. She had always thought the moment would be filled with joy, that Lucas would be by her side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement as they welcomed their children into the world. Instead, what should have been the happiest day of her life turned into a nightmare she would never forget. The labor was long and grueling. Sophia had been admitted to the hospital 2 days before her due date when her contractions began. The doctors had warned her that carrying triplets came with risks, and they monitored her closely as she struggled through the pain. Lucas was there, at first. He paced the hospital room, restless and anxious, barely meeting her gaze. Whenever the nurses came in to check on her, he asked how long it would take, as if he were waiting for an inconvenience to pass rather than witnessing the birth of his own children. Sophia was exhausted by the time the doctors decided on an emergency C-section. The baby's heart rates had become irregular, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. As she was wheeled into the operating room, she reached for Lucas's hand, expecting comfort, but his grip was limp, detached. "I'll be right here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. The room was bright, sterile, and filled with the sound of beeping machines and hurried voices. Sophia felt nothing from the waist down, only the pressure of the doctors working to deliver her babies. She was overwhelmed, her mind racing, her heart pounding as she waited for the first cries. Then they came. 1, 2, 3. The sound of her newborn's cries filled the room and tears blurred Sophia's vision. She turned her head, searching for Lucas's reaction, but when she saw his face, the air left her lungs. Lucas had gone completely still, his eyes locked on the newborns, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak. He was frozen in place as the nurses lifted the babies, cleaning them and preparing to place them in Sophia's arms. But he didn't look at her. He was staring at the children. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Lucas?" she called weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. But he was gone. A nurse placed one of the babies in her arms, and Sophia instinctively held the tiny bundle close, her heart aching with love and confusion. She barely had time to process what had just happened. She wanted to believe Lucas had simply stepped out for a moment, that he was overwhelmed, that he would return. But deep down, a sickening feeling settled in her stomach. Something was wrong. Hours passed, and Lucas didn't come back. The nurses assured her that he was probably just taking a break, that some fathers had a hard time processing the reality of childbirth. But Sophia knew better. This wasn't nerves. This was something else. By the time she was moved into a private recovery room with her newborns, her exhaustion had overtaken her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. When she woke up, her mother, Elizabeth, was sitting beside her, gently rocking one of the babies. The sight brought Sophia some comfort, but the moment she saw the expression on her mother's face, her heart dropped. "Sophia," Elizabeth said softly, her voice laced with concern. "Lucas is gone." She felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. "What do you mean he's gone?" she rasped, her throat dry and hoarse. Elizabeth hesitated. "He left. The nurses said he stormed out of the hospital after you gave birth. He didn't even sign the paperwork, he just left." A cold, sick feeling spread through Sophia's chest. No, this wasn't happening. She struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain shooting through her abdomen. "Did he say anything? Did he left these," Elizabeth interrupted, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope. Sophia's hands trembled as she took it, ripping it open. Inside was a note, hastily scrawled, the words uneven and angry. "I know what you did. I know these aren't my children. Don't ever come back to my house. We're done." The world tilted. Sophia's fingers tightened around the paper. No, this couldn't be real. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could Lucas, her Lucas, think for even a second that these babies weren't his? She had never been with anyone else. She had been nothing but faithful to him. This accusation, this betrayal, it made no sense. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at her babies, each of them so small, so perfect. They were his. She knew they were his, and yet he had abandoned them. Her mother's voice broke through the haze of her thoughts. "Sophia, I went by the house to get some things for you. He's locked you out. Your keys don't work. And the joint bank account." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He emptied it." Sophia barely registered the gasp that escaped her own lips. Everything she had built with him, every penny she had contributed to that account, every investment, every sacrifice, gone. She had nothing. Lucas had not only abandoned her and their children, he had made sure she had no way to fight back. Sophia closed her eyes, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion, rage, and heartbreak. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to march out of that hospital and force Lucas to look her in the eyes and explain how he could do this to her. But she had 3 newborns dependent on her now. She had no time for rage, no time for grief, only survival. She opened her eyes, inhaling a slow, deep breath. Her mother squeezed her hand, offering silent support. Sophia looked down at her babies, her children, her responsibility, and made a silent vow. Lucas may have walked away. He may have stolen from her, may have betrayed her in the most unforgivable way, but she would not break. She would not let him destroy her. She would rise no matter how much it hurt, because she had no choice. She had to. Sophia had never felt so lost in her life. In the span of 24 hours, her entire world had collapsed. She had gone from believing she was about to start a beautiful life with Lucas and their children to realizing she had been cast aside like she meant nothing. Her husband, her supposed partner, had abandoned her at her most vulnerable, leaving her with 3 newborns and no means to support them. The pain was unbearable, the betrayal so deep it felt like a wound that would never heal. But she didn't have time to fall apart. Lying in that hospital bed, holding her babies close, she knew she couldn't afford to break down. She had 3 innocent lives depending on her, and no matter how much her heart ached, she had to be strong. Her mother, Elizabeth, was the first to step in, offering a place for Sophia and the babies to stay. "We'll figure this out," she assured her, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. "You're not alone." Sophia wanted to believe her, but the road ahead seemed impossible. She had no home, no money, no job to return to immediately, as she had planned to take maternity leave while she and Lucas adjusted to parenthood. Now there was no Lucas, no support system, only uncertainty. Leaving the hospital felt surreal. The nurses helped her into a wheelchair while Elizabeth carried the babies, each bundled up in soft blankets. As they were wheeled to the hospital entrance, Sophia felt like a ghost in her own life, watching as her new reality unfolded around her. Lucas should have been here. He should have been the one bringing her home, helping her into the car, making sure the babies were safe. But he wasn't. Instead, his absence loomed over her like a shadow, suffocating and all-consuming. As they drove away from the hospital, Sophia turned her head to look out the window, her thoughts racing. She had spent so much of her life fighting for success, for security, believing that if she worked hard enough she would never have to struggle the way her mother had. And yet, here she was, homeless, penniless, abandoned. Except now, she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her children. That alone gave her the strength to push forward. Elizabeth's home was small but warm, filled with memories of a life Sophia had once known. She had grown up here, in this modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was safe. She placed the babies in the crib Elizabeth had set up in the guest room. As she watched them sleep, the reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was alone in this. No matter how much her mother helped, no one could fix what Lucas had done. She couldn't rely on him. She had to figure out a way to survive. The first few weeks were brutal. Caring for 1 newborn was exhausting. Caring for 3 was an entirely different level of exhaustion. Sophia barely slept, waking every few hours to feed, change, and soothe her babies. Her emotions were raw, the betrayal still fresh in her mind, but there was no time to process it. Every ounce of her energy was spent keeping her children fed and cared for. Her mother was a godsend, helping as much as she could, but the financial strain quickly became apparent. Sophia needed a job, and fast. Finding work while recovering from childbirth and caring for 3 newborns felt impossible. Her former business, her pride and joy, had suffered while she had been pregnant. She had planned to take a short maternity leave and return with Lucas's support, but now she had no choice but to start over. She spent nights researching job openings, submitting applications while her baby slept. She knew she couldn't afford to be picky. Any job that paid enough to support her children was better than nothing. But it wasn't just about the money. She needed to rebuild herself. She needed to prove, to herself, to Lucas, to everyone, that she could survive without him. That he hadn't broken her. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Sophia found her footing. She landed a job at a small marketing firm, the pay modest but stable. It wasn't what she had envisioned for herself, but it was a start. With her first paycheck, she bought diapers, formula, and a few essentials for the babies. The satisfaction of providing for them on her own was unlike anything she had ever felt. She had been knocked down, humiliated, left to fend for herself, but she was still standing. And that was just the beginning. Life had finally begun to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't easy. Nothing about Sophia's new reality was, but she was learning how to survive. She worked long hours, juggled motherhood with exhaustion, and sacrificed sleep to build a life for her children. Her mother, Elizabeth, was a pillar of support, helping care for the triplets while Sophia worked. Every morning, Sophia kissed her babies goodbye, promising them she would return, and every night she collapsed into bed, barely able to keep her eyes open. But despite the hardships, there was something deeply fulfilling about it all. She had done this. She had rebuilt her life from nothing. She didn't need Lucas, at least that's what she kept telling herself. Then the letters started. At first, she thought nothing of them. The first one was tucked into her mailbox, written in a handwriting she didn't recognize. "You lied to me. You think you've won, but you haven't." Sophia had stared at the note for a long time, her stomach twisting in unease. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, maybe a prank, maybe a mistake. But then another letter came. And another. Each one more threatening than the last. "I know what you did. You destroyed my life. You will regret this." She didn't need to guess who was sending them. She knew. Lucas. The thought of him watching her, still holding on to his anger after all these years, sent a chill down her spine. But she refused to be intimidated. She had spent too long crawling out of the hole he had left her in. She wasn't going to let him drag her back down. Then things escalated. She came home late one night after a long shift at work, stepping inside to find the living room slightly off. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't until she went into her bedroom and found another letter, this time placed neatly on her pillow, that she realized the truth. Someone had been inside. Her hands trembled as she picked up the note. "You think you can keep me away? You think you can erase me? You're wrong." Panic surged through her. She checked on the babies first, rushing to their room, her heart hammering in her chest. They were asleep, untouched, but the mere thought that someone had been close to them made her sick. Lucas was getting bolder, and she was running out of time. The police were useless. She had gone to them the next morning, the letters clutched tightly in her hands. She explained everything, the threats, the break-in, the fear that Lucas was watching her, but without proof, without physical evidence of who had been in her house, there was nothing they could do. "Just be cautious," the officer told her, his voice laced with indifference. And if anything else happens, let us know." As if that was supposed to bring her comfort. Sophia walked out of the station, feeling more alone than ever. Days passed, and Sophia became hyper-aware of her surroundings. She changed the locks, installed security cameras, and double-checked the doors every night. But the fear remained. She didn't tell her mother. She didn't want to worry her. Instead, she carried the weight alone, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next letter, the next threat. Then, one evening, the unthinkable happened. Sophia had gone to pick up the triplets from school, exhausted, but relieved that the day was almost over. She was walking towards the front gate when one of her sons, Elijah, ran up to her, a folded piece of paper in his small hands. "A man gave me this," he said innocently. "He told me to give it to you." Sophia's blood turned to ice. She snatched the paper from Elijah's hands, unfolding it with shaking fingers. "I can always get close to you. To them. Now, do you believe me?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. Lucas had been there. He had been close enough to her children to hand them a note. She fought the urge to collapse, to scream, to break apart from sheer terror. Instead, she knelt down, forcing herself to stay calm as she gripped Elijah's shoulders. "What did the man look like, baby?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Elijah shrugged. "I don't know. He just said you would know who it was." "Lucas." Sophia rose, her hands clenched into fists. Enough. She wasn't going to let him terrorize her any longer. It was time to put an end to this. Sophia barely slept that night. Every noise, every creak in the house sent her nerves into overdrive. She checked the locks 3 times, stared at the security camera feed on her phone, and listened to her children's steady breathing as they slept. But no matter how tightly she wrapped herself in caution, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Lucas had crossed the final line. He had gone from tormenting her in letters to coming close, too close, to her children. And that was something she could never forgive. The next morning, she called the school, demanding to see the security footage. The principal was hesitant at first, insisting that school policy didn't allow parents to access security recordings without proper authorization. But Sophia refused to take no for an answer. After an hour of escalating the issue, they finally let her watch the tapes from the previous day. She sat in the school's small security office, her hands clenched in her lap as the footage played on the screen. Children ran across the playground, parents gathered at the front gate. Teachers guided students to their buses. Then she saw it. A man stood near the entrance, wearing a dark hoodie, his back partially turned to the camera. He wasn't directly interacting with the children, but at one point he stepped closer to Elijah. Sophia held her breath as she watched her son take something from him. The note. The angle was terrible. The man never fully turned his face to the camera, but even from the grainy footage, Sophia knew. She recognized the way he stood, the tension in his shoulders, the slight stiffness in his posture. It was Lucas. The security guard paused the video. "Do you know who this is?" Sophia exhaled sharply, her stomach twisting. "Yes, his name is Lucas Carter. He's my ex, and he's not supposed to be anywhere near my children." The principal, who had been silent up until now, folded her hands on the desk. "If this man is a threat, we need to notify the authorities. Do you have a restraining order against him?" Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, I didn't think I needed one before." She hated admitting that, hated the fact that for years she had assumed Lucas was gone, that he had left her behind and moved on with his life. She had let herself believe she was safe. Now she knew better. The principal gave her a sympathetic look. "You should file for one immediately. In the meantime, we'll make sure the school staff is aware. If he comes near the children again, we'll contact the police immediately." Sophia nodded, gripping her bag as she stood. She thanked them, but as she walked out of the office, a deep, unsettling feeling weighed in her chest. A restraining order wouldn't stop Lucas. He had already proved that he didn't care about rules. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And she still didn't know exactly what that was. She spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind racing with possibilities. Lucas had accused her of cheating. He had insisted, from the moment their children were born, that they couldn't be his. But he had never taken a paternity test. He had never tried to prove his claims, only abandoned them and left her to suffer. If he truly believed they weren't his, why was he back now? Why, after all these years, was he obsessed with tormenting her? There was something she was missing. That night, after putting the children to bed, she sat on the couch with her laptop searching for anything she could find on Lucas. She hadn't looked him up in years, hadn't dared to, but now she needed answers. Most of the results were generic. Old corporate profiles from his past jobs, outdated social media accounts he hadn't used in years. But then she found something that made her heart stop. An article. "Wealthy real estate heir accused of fraud disappears without a trace." Her breath caught as she clicked on it, scanning the text. The article was from 3 years ago. It detailed a scandal involving Lucas's former employer, a high-end real estate firm that had been caught in a major financial fraud scheme. The CEO had been indicted, several executives had been charged, and Lucas had vanished. He had left his job, his entire career. He had disappeared just as the authorities had begun investigating the company. Sophia's fingers trembled as she scrolled down. There was speculation that Lucas had taken a cut of the stolen money and fled. There had even been rumors that he had changed his identity, though nothing had ever been confirmed. He had been running, hiding, and now, after all these years, he had resurfaced. Her blood ran cold. Lucas wasn't just here for revenge. He needed something. And whatever it was, Sophia knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop until he got it. Sophia barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Her reflection was tense, her eyes sharp with exhaustion and unease. She had spent years rebuilding herself, and now, in just a few weeks, Lucas had managed to bring back the fear she thought she had buried. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't a broken woman begging him to listen, to stay, to care. This time, she was ready to fight. She spent the entire night reading through every article, every forum discussion, and every financial report she could find related to Lucas's disappearance. The deeper she went, the clearer the picture became. He had been a part of a fraudulent scheme, though whether he had actively participated or had been a scapegoat was still unclear. What was clear, however, was that he had no stability, no home, and, most likely, no money. That's why he had come back. He had lost everything, and now, for some reason, he had decided that she was the answer to his problems. The thought filled her with fury. After everything he had put her through, he had the audacity to think she owed him anything. She slammed the laptop shut, rubbing her temples as the exhaustion finally started to weigh her down. Her babies, no, her children, because they weren't babies anymore, were asleep down the hall. She couldn't let this continue. It was time to take control of the situation. The next morning, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer. She needed a restraining order, but more importantly, She needed to ensure that Lucas had no legal claim over her children. The last thing she needed was for him to attempt something drastic. The second call was to an old acquaintance, a private investigator she had once worked with back when she was still running her own business. He owed her a favor, and she was cashing it in. She wanted to know everything about Lucas. She needed to know his next move before he made it. Hours later, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her mother when the phone rang. It was the investigator. His voice was cautious, as if he wasn't sure he should be the one telling her what he had found. "Sophia," he said, "there's something you need to know about Lucas's family. Something I don't think even he knew for most of his life." She sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "Go on." "His father isn't his biological father. His mother had an affair years before he was born. The man Lucas thought was his father was never really his blood relative." Her mind stalled for a second, unable to process what she had just heard. "What? Are you sure? I found medical records, old letters, and some sealed legal documents. His biological father was a black man, Sophia. Lucas never knew, or at least he wasn't supposed to know. His mother covered it up. But genetically, he is mixed race. That explains why your children look the way they do. They're his, Sophia. He lied to you." Everything round her blurred. The years of pain, the abandonment, the humiliation. She had suffered through it all because of a lie. Lucas had known, or maybe he hadn't, but it didn't matter. The truth had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. His accusations, his disgust, his cruelty, it had all been for nothing. A slow, burning anger unfurled inside her. He had destroyed their family over something that had never been real. He had left her to struggle, forced her to fight for survival, all while carrying his children, all while believing she had been betrayed. And now, after all these years, he had come back, tormenting her, watching her, threatening her. She had wasted so much time mourning a man who had never deserved her love. She thanked the investigator, hung up the phone, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Elizabeth, who'd been watching from across the table, spoke first. "What did he say?" Sophia looked at her mother, her expression unreadable. "Lucas's father wasn't his real father. His mother had an affair. His real father was black." Her mother inhaled sharply. "So the children were always his?" "Yes." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of it all settled between them like a thick fog. Then her mother, always the pragmatic one, nodded firmly. "So, what are you going to do now?" Sophia lifted her chin, her expression cold and determined. "I'm going to end this. For good." Sophia had always thought that learning the truth about Lucas would bring her closure, that knowing he had destroyed their family over a lie would somehow make it easier to move on. But all it did was reignite a fire inside her. She had suffered for years because of him. She had struggled, cried, lost sleep, doubted herself, all because Lucas had chosen to run instead of face reality. And now he was back, lurking in the shadows, trying to frighten her into submission. She wasn't going to let him win. The restraining order was filed within 24 hours. Her lawyer assured her that it would be granted quickly given the circumstances, but even that wasn't enough. Lucas had already proven that rules meant nothing to him. He had broken into her home, sent her threatening messages, and, worst of all, had gotten close to their children. A piece of paper wasn't going to stop him. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. For days she waited, watching, anticipating his next move. She barely slept, constantly checking the security cameras and double-checking the locks. The children were never out of sight, never left alone for even a second. If Lucas tried something again, she was going to be prepared. Then, one evening, as she was locking up the house for the night, her phone buzzed with a text message. "Come outside." Her stomach clenched. There was no number attached, but she knew. She stepped toward the window, slowly parting the curtain, and her breath caught in her throat. Lucas was standing across the street. Even from this distance, she could see the desperation in his posture. His shoulders were slumped, his clothes disheveled, his face thinner than she remembered. He looked like a man who had been losing a battle for years, and now he was at his breaking point. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She turned away from the window, exhaling slowly. This was it. She dialed the police with one hand as she walked to the front door with the other. She wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to cower in fear. She was going to end this. By the time she stepped outside, Lucas had moved closer, standing just at the edge of her driveway. His eyes darted around, scanning the neighborhood, as if he knew he shouldn't be here, but couldn't stop himself. "You finally decided to come out," he said, his voice hoarse. Sophia crossed her arms, keeping a safe distance between them. "What do you want, Lucas?" He let out a bitter laugh. "What do I want? You took everything from me, Sophia. My life, my family. You turned my own children against me." Her jaw clenched. "I didn't turn them against you. You abandoned them. You walked away." "I thought they weren't mine." His voice rose, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think I wanted to believe that? I was told my whole life that I came from a line of pure blood, that my father—" He cut himself off, shaking his head, as if even saying the words out loud made him sick. "You have no idea what it was like, finding out that everything I believed was a lie." Sophia took a step forward, her voice steady. "And what did you do when you found out the truth, Lucas? Did you come back and apologize? Did you try to make it right?" "No. You ran. You let me struggle. You let your children grow up without you. And then, when you had nothing left, you came crawling back, sending threats, breaking into my home, scaring me, scaring them." He flinched but didn't deny it. "You ruined me," he whispered. Sophia felt her nails dig into her palms. "No, Lucas, you ruined yourself." A tense silence stretched between them. For a brief moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or realization. But whatever it was, it disappeared in an instant, replaced by something darker. His jaw tightened and his gaze shifted to the house behind her. "Where are they?" Her breath hitched. "Don't." Lucas took a step forward, and that was when the flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The sound of police sirens cut through the night, and within seconds, officers swarmed around them. Lucas's head snapped toward the approaching cars, his body tensing. "You called the cops on me?" Sophia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Two officers stepped forward, guns drawn, commanding him to put his hands up. For a second, she thought he might run, but then, slowly, he lifted his hands in surrender. As they pushed him against the hood of the police car, cuffing his wrists behind his back, he turned to look at her one last time. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice low and full of venom. Sophia met his gaze, unflinching. "It already is." And with that, she turned her back on him for the last time. For the first time in years, Sophia woke up without fear. The nightmares that had haunted her, the uncertainty, the paranoia, the suffocating weight of always looking over her shoulder, had finally begun to fade. Lucas was gone, arrested, out of her life. And with him, The last remnants of the pain he had caused her had started to dissipate. The house was quiet, the early morning sunlight spilling through the curtains. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle over her. It was a strange thing, peace. After living in constant tension for so long, she almost didn't know what to do with it. But she wasn't going to waste it. She had fought too hard to get here. She rolled onto her side, glancing at the small clock on the nightstand. It was almost time for the triplets to wake up. They had grown so much, their laughter filling the house in a way that reminded her why she had fought so hard to protect them. They didn't know all the details of what had happened. She had shielded them from the worst of it, but they knew enough to understand that the man who had hurt her, the man who had abandoned them, was no longer a part of their lives. She got up, stretched, and made her way to the kitchen, where her mother was already pouring herself a cup of coffee. Elizabeth glanced up, smiling as she took in the sight of her daughter looking lighter. "How does it feel?" Sophia opened the fridge, pulling out milk for the kids' breakfast. "Strange, but good. Free." Elizabeth nodded knowingly. "You deserve that." Sophia paused, exhaling slowly. "I know." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The last few days had been a whirlwind. After Lucas's arrest, she had spent hours at the police station, answering questions, providing evidence, ensuring that there was enough to keep him locked away. It hadn't been easy reliving everything, but it had been necessary. Her lawyer had reassured her that given the multiple charges against him, stalking, breaking and entering, harassment, there was little chance of him getting out any time soon. But she wasn't naive. She knew the legal system. She knew that, eventually, he would try to fight his way back into the world. But by then, she would be ready, because she wasn't that frightened, abandoned woman anymore. She had rebuilt herself once. And this time, there was nothing left for Lucas to break. The sound of small feet pattering against the wooden floor pulled her from her thoughts. The triplets ran into the kitchen, their laughter filling the space, their sleepy faces still soft with the remnants of dreams. "Mommy!" Elijah was the first to reach her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Can we have pancakes?" Sophia smiled, ruffling his curls. "I think that can be arranged." Olivia and Noah quickly chimed in, cheering as they scrambled into their chairs. Elizabeth chuckled, watching as Sophia moved around the kitchen with an ease she hadn't seen in years. As she flipped pancakes, Sophia thought about how far they had come, about the nights she had spent wondering if she would ever make it out of the darkness, about the mornings she had woken up dreading what the day would bring. But now there was no more dread, no more uncertainty. There was only the future. A few hours later, after breakfast was finished and the kids were playing in the backyard, Sophia sat down with her laptop. It was time to take the next step. She had spent the last several years working tirelessly to provide for her children, taking whatever jobs she could to keep them safe and secure. But she was ready for more. Her old business, the dream she had once built before Lucas had taken everything from her, was calling her back. She had the experience, the knowledge, and now the resources to bring it back to life. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and risk. But if there was one thing Sophia had learned, it was that she was capable of surviving anything. She pulled up her old business plan, the one she had drafted years ago, before her life had been derailed. She made some adjustments, added some new goals, and started making phone calls. By the time the afternoon sun began to set, she had already lined up meetings, reconnected with old contacts, and set her sights on reclaiming what had once been hers. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, she sat beside them for a long time, stroking their hair, listening to their steady breathing. She had done it. She had protected them. And now she was going to give them the life they deserved. As she stood up, turning off the light, she let one final thought settle in her heart. Lucas had been a chapter in her story, a painful, devastating chapter, but he wasn't the ending. Not even close. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new one. Check out our other videos for more incredible stories, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. See you in the next one.